Hi, everyone. I'm David Crary, and I work in growth consulting at Google Play, working with app developers to help them improve their engagement and monetization. Today, we're going to explore how you can use buyer category user affinities to maximize the monetization opportunities in your apps. Now, to set the stage about the importance of considering these user affinities, let's take a quick look at how widely spread user time is. Probably unsurprising, but users have a lot of apps and games. In an average month, a user is engaging with 24 different apps and games across 8 different categories for more than 2.5 hours a day. And when we limit to just buyers, the distribution is even greater. A buyer is engaging with 40 different apps and games, which is nearly 70% more than the 24 we just saw for non-buyers. This is across 11 different categories for almost 4 hours a day. So, how are you going to capitalize on this distributed attention? Well, you can use buyer category affinities to help you guide your strategies to expand into untapped user bases and to better satisfy your existing buyers. All right. You've heard me use this word affinity a few times. I want to make sure we're on the same page and I provide you a definition. So, today, when we talk about affinity or affinities, what we're referring to is the preference or overlap of two or more topics. And specifically today, it's going to be the overlap of two or more app categories in which your buyers are either engaging or purchasing in. Now, to utilize these category affinities, it is imperative for you to understand where your new buyers are coming from and where they go to next. So today we're going to use this graphic as kind of an illustrative framework for how we can think about that new buyer journey. On the left, what we're looking at is where your new buyers have spent in the preceding 12 months before they become a new buyer in your app. So maybe they've spent in an app in your same category or in a different category or game. Maybe they've been reactivated after a longer period of dormancy or have never spent on play at all. Understanding where your new buyers are coming from is the first step to utilizing this category affinity. If you can understand where they're coming from, this can inform your user acquisition strategy, you can optimize your SKUs, and you can plan what features you want to put on your roadmap next. And we're going to talk to all of these ideas today. Similarly, it's important to consider and understand where your buyers are going to next. So perhaps they return and buy in your app again. Maybe they go on to buy in an app in your same category or another category or game. If you can identify and grok where your new buyers go on to next, you can optimize your re-engagement campaigns, and you can reimagine your SKUs for how you can prevent buyer churn. So we're going to be utilizing this framework for the talk today. First, we'll walk through the buyer inflow distributions across categories and see how those differ. Then we'll take a look at what these new buyers are buying, and again, how those are different. And finally, we're going to look at where your new buyers are going on to next, what they're buying, and then how you can use that information today. Let's get started with the buyer inflow and take a look at where your new buyers are coming from. So it's probably not a surprise, but your new buyers have a diverse buying history. What we're looking at here is the buyer inflow distribution across all app categories based on where the new buyers had spent in the preceding 12 months. So at the top, we see that nearly a quarter, 23%, of all new buyers had spent in an app in the same category in the preceding year. Next, we see buyers who had spent in another app category or a game at 40%. And then at the bottom, these are buyers who are either reactivated after a long period of dormancy or new buyers to play entirely at 37%. Okay, so now we have our holistic benchmark. Let's dig a little bit deeper. Within app categories, what we've seen is that they generally follow one of 3 new buyer patterns. And today you're going to hear me refer to them as buckets. It's just a collection of categories. First is the pendulum bucket. So buyers here will buy in an app for a medium to longer period of time, and they may come and go after some period of an absence. And an example here might be a dating app. Next are the anchor apps. Typically, a buyer will really only need one app in a category. This app will serve a very specific purpose, and they tend to be generally pretty sticky apps. So an example here might be a music app. And finally, we have the multi-tool apps. Now, this is where a buyer will go get some content from app A, they're going to buy content in app B, subscribe to app C, and this is going to be interchangeable and simultaneous. So an example here might be a books app. All right, we have our buckets. Let's sort the categories now. I'm going to leave this up for just a moment. Please go ahead and peruse the list, find your category. How many pendulum apps do we have? Anybody? Nice, excellent. Anchor apps and any pendula, or I'm sorry, any multi-tool? Yes, excellent. We have somebody from all of them. Okay, so go ahead and follow along with these buckets today, as you'll be able to associate the insights of that bucket with your app category and your app itself. All right, we've gotten our buckets, we sorted our categories. Let's go ahead and take a look at how the new buyer inflow distributions differ. We're going to leave this up for just a moment. We're going to go into each one of these individually. So, right now, I just want you to appreciate the differences before we do dive in. What we see first, first we're going to dive in with the pendulum apps. Now, this could be dating apps, health and fitness, media and entertainment. You'll notice that in the bottom left corner, we've listed out the categories. We'll persist this throughout the presentation today in case you want to refer back to which categories are in the bucket. So, with pendulum apps, what we see is that they have the most evenly distributed new buyer inflow, with nearly three-quarters of their new buyers coming from somewhere other than same apps in their category. However, when a buyer comes from an app in their same category, they will have historically in the preceding year spent 1.5 times as much. So that could mean for apps in these categories that maybe buyers in your same app category could be more valuable. And next, we're going to take a look at the anchor apps. Now, this could be education, music, news, lifestyle. With the anchor apps, what we see is that they have the least inflow of new buyers from other apps in their same category at just 7%, which really speaks to the stickiness and the specific use case nature of these categories. In fact, buyers here are 6 times more likely to come from another app category or game. And when they do, those new buyers will have historically spent twice as much in the preceding year, indicating that maybe for apps in these categories in the anchor bucket, buyers from other app categories could be more valuable. Next, we look at the multi tool apps. And this could be comics, this could be books, this could be games. What we see is that this is the only bucket where the largest inflow source is actually buyers from apps in the same category at 41%. Now, similar to pendulum apps, but kind of in a far more pronounced fashion, we see that buyers who had spent in the same app category before will have historically spent 3 times as much in the preceding year versus buyers who came from either games or other app categories, indicating that similar to pendulum apps, those buyers may be more useful. So, what does this all mean and how can you use it? Well, you can combine where your new buyers are coming from with their historical propensity to consume. A few ideas for how you might want to think about that. The first is, can you consider adding a secondary user experience? Can you add a social aspect to your app? Would a tool or goal oriented feature be valuable for your users? Another idea could be to reallocate your user acquisition spend to more adequately address the markets and the categories in which your new buyers are coming from. And then a third idea could be to lean into some of the feature overlaps that you might have with these other categories or games. Again, these are just a few ideas, and I'm sure you're going to be able to come up with more personalized ways to reach your new buyer populations that could have a dramatic improvement in your new buyer conversion. Now that we've explored where your new buyers are coming from, let's talk about what they've purchased first and how they differ across the new buyer inflow sources. For pendulum apps, what we see is that new buyers convert relatively similarly, regardless of their historical spend in the category. So, in this table on the right, what we're going to do is compare buyers who have spent in your category in the preceding year versus those who hadn't. What we see is that their first purchase price is relatively similar at $24 and $22 respectively, and decently high. Similarly, we see that they both have very similar and very high propensity to convert first on subscriptions above 90%. Now, on that second point, is this due to a preference for subscriptions, or could it be due to the lack of availability of affordable IAP SKUs? And maybe it's both. We're going to find out later on where these buyers go on to buy that we could maybe use to inform our response to that question here. Next, we're going to take a look at the anchor apps, which differ pretty considerably from Pendulum. New buyers who had spent in an app in the category before convert on subscription 53% of the time, which is more than double the 25% for buyers who hadn't bought in the category before. You'll also notice that their first purchase price is more than double as well, which of course just correlates with the fact that subscriptions tend to be more expensive relative to IAPs. Now, with the multi tool apps, we see kind of an opposite trend where buyers who had spent in the category before convert on subscriptions 9% of the time, which is less than half of the 22 for buyers who hadn't yet spent in the category. So I find these trends within the buckets pretty interesting, but also kind of fascinating how different they are across the buckets, right? So to summarize, your different new buyer populations deserve different personalized value proposition offerings. Now, a few ideas to consider. Can you optimize your SKUs and maybe even consider expanding your SKU offerings? Maybe make sure you have premium and value SKUs, subscriptions, and IAPs. Another idea could be to reassess your CPI thresholds, as we've just seen that these different buyer inflow groups have different propensities to convert on more or less expensive SKUs and differences in preferences for subscriptions versus IAPs. So, what are you going to do to capitalize on that? And a third idea could be to customize your intro offers and bundles based on what these different buyer inflow groups are buying first. Okay, so now that we've covered where your new buyers are coming from and what they buy first, let's switch gears a little bit, as we've heard from many developers that churn is a primary concern. So let's take a look at the outflow and where your new buyers are going on to next. Spoiler alert, most of your new buyers are not leaving your app for apps in the same category. They're not going to your direct competitors. In fact, we've seen that new buyers are, on average, 6 times more likely to repeat purchase in your app in the following year than they are to stop spending in your app and go to a competitor. This chart is slightly more complicated, so I am going to walk through it and provide an example. What we're looking at is how your new buyers are spending in the 12 months after they become a new buyer in your app. So let's use a dating app as an example. So the top bucket would be buyers who continue to spend in your app but are not spending in another dating app. The next bucket is going to be buyers who spend in your dating app and in another dating app. Third bucket, buyers who have stopped spending in yours and are spending in a different dating app only. And then the bottom bucket is going to be they're not spending in any dating apps whatsoever in the following year. And this is how we will look at it for all of the categories. So with the pendulum apps, what we see is that they have the highest percentage of buyers who leave your app and go on to spend in another app category, or sorry, another app in your category, and the highest percentage of buyers who stop spending in the category entirely at 14% and 44% respectively. So I want to focus on that 44%, as that represents the largest source of buyer churn and the biggest potential source of lost revenue. So what can you provide these buyers to keep them coming back and buying again? How can you keep them engaged with new content, new SKUs, new purchase options, new features? So stay tuned, as the next talk from my teammate Tammy is going to dive into some of these topics. Next, when we look at the anchor apps, we see that they have by far the least outflow to competitors at just 3%. And this could be somewhat intuitive if you remember from the buyer inflows that just 7% of their new buyers were coming from other apps in the same category. So, however, similar to pendulum apps, we see that they have a substantial percentage of buyers no longer spending in the category at 42%. So, given that they're not going to competitors, what features and user experiences can we consider adding to keep these buyers around? Now, you can imagine this is going to be a different tack than the pendulum apps, who also have to focus on not losing buyers to competitors. So, perhaps here it's a less of a focus on differentiation from your direct competitors, and instead, how can you focus on getting your buyers to just come back to your app on a daily basis? And now with multi-tool apps, we see that buyers will frequently swap back and forth. The largest outflow source here is actually buyers who continue to buy in your app and are buying in a competitor app in the following year at 36%. So this is clear to us that one app is not satisfying their needs. Hence, in order to solve that, they need multiple of them. That's how we came up with multi-tool. Sorry. So competition is pretty tight here. So how can you investigate approaching content parity with your competitors to ensure that you provide them with an equivalent value and what your buyers are seeking that in which they have to go to competitors for. All right, so now that we've taken a look at where your new buyers are going to next, let's see what we can learn about how they're buying later on. We've seen that when a buyer does leave, their spending preferences can change considerably. These buyers shift their price sensitivities, and their preferences for subscriptions versus IAPs can change as well. So, for these metrics, what we're comparing is how your new buyers are spending in the 12 months after they stop spending in your app compared to how they were spending in your app. So, for pendulum apps, what we see is that when a buyer leaves, their average transaction value is 42% lower, and they're 5 times less likely to buy subscriptions. Now, you recall when we were looking at buyer inflows, and we saw that greater than 90% of new buyers were converting on subscriptions first. We said, was this due to a preference or lack of availability of affordable IAP SKUs? So, given these buyers go on to spend less per transaction and are far less likely to convert on subscriptions, this represents a distinct opportunity to introduce more IAPs and specifically more affordable IAPs that these buyers are clearly seeking. Next, we take a look at the pendulum or the anchor apps, which are quite different. They are very slightly more likely to convert on subscriptions when they leave, but it's not terribly meaningful. Instead, what we see is that their average transaction value upon departure is nearly 70% higher. So perhaps the takeaway here is to consider how you can add a more premium SKU for these buyers that they clearly are seeking elsewhere. And last, with the multi-tool apps, we do see that their average transaction value is basically the same when they leave, 4% higher. It's not terribly meaningful, but that these buyers go on to buy subscriptions, are 5 times more likely to buy subscriptions upon departure. So, given that they have this appetite for subscriptions, what can you do to introduce more subscription SKUs into your apps that these buyers are clearly going on to buy? And how can you introduce it at a relatively similar transaction value that they are converting on now? So that was a lot of numbers. What can you do about this? Well, in order to retain and re-engage your churned buyers, you need to provide them with personalized experiences. Now, this could be returning offers and discounts based on either where your new buyers are coming from or where they go on to next or what they're purchasing next. It could also look like creating features that are similar to games. Anecdotally, we've seen that games represent a very large percentage of inflow and outflow across many categories. So, what are you going to do to capitalize on that? And last is to think about your pricing and value diversification. Are you packaging your value for your buyers the right way? Are you offering them IAPs and subscriptions, annuals, monthlies? Is your pricing optimized? And then finally, how can you expand your value propositions for both your inflow and outflow audiences? All right, so let's go ahead and take a little step back. We've explored where your buyers come from, what they buy first, and where they go on to next. It's clear that kind of understanding your new buyers' preferences and affinities is essential for continued growth. So, as we close out, let's remember that 60 to 90% of your new buyers are new buyers to your category. Now, in light of that information, how can you consider expanding your user acquisition strategies to more adequately cover where these new buyers are coming from? Next, we see that when these new buyers do purchase for the first time, that they vary considerably with respect to their preferences for subscriptions, often by 2 times or more. Now, this of course has an implicit impact on their first purchase price. So perhaps here, the takeaway is to consider how you can optimize your SKUs and customize your offers based on what these buyers are more likely to convert on. And lastly, we see that when buyers leave, only 3 to 14% of the time are they leaving for one of your direct competitors. We also see that when a buyer does leave, it's often due to pricing sensitivities or differences in preferences for subscriptions versus IAPs. Conversely, we see that 40 to 70% of your new buyers do return, right? So perhaps here, the takeaway is how you can consider your pricing and value diversification. Make sure you're offering the SKUs that your buyers are seeking either from you or from your competitors. So, with that, it's been a pleasure speaking with you all today. Please feel free to grab me and say hi. I'll be around all day if you want to learn more. And as mentioned, Tammy is actually going to come on stage now and talk to you all about resubscription trends in your apps. Tammy?